Whispers in the Night. Chapter 1. A Nightly Visitor. The house was still, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Outside, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, creating a soothing symphony of nature. It was an ordinary night in the Thompson household, or so it seemed. Sarah Thompson stirred in her sleep, feeling an odd sense of unease. She turned over, expecting to see her husband, Mark, snoring softly beside her. Instead, she was met with the sight of her 8-year-old daughter, Lily, standing at the foot of the bed. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Lily, honey, what are you doing here?" Sarah asked, her voice groggy with sleep. Lily's eyes were closed, her face a mask of tranquility. She took a step closer and whispered, "I'm sorry. The devil told me to." Sarah's blood ran cold. She reached out to shake Mark awake, but he was already stirring, having heard their daughter's eerie proclamation. Together, they watched as Lily turned and walked out of the room, her movements slow and deliberate, like a puppet on strings. Chapter 2. Unsettling Revelations. The next morning over breakfast, Sarah and Mark exchanged worried glances. Lily seemed her usual cheerful self, chattering about her upcoming school play and her latest drawing project. There was no hint of the disturbing episode from the previous night. "Do you remember coming into our room last night, Lily?" Sarah asked gently. Lily looked up from her cereal, her brow furrowing in confusion. "No, Mommy, did I have a bad dream?" Sarah forced a smile. "Something like that. Don't worry about it, sweetie." But worry they did. Over the next few nights, the sleepwalking continued. Each time Lily would enter their room, whisper the same unsettling words, and then return to her bed, unaware of her nocturnal wanderings. Mark suggested they visit Dr. Patel, a child psychologist. "Maybe she can help us figure out what's going on," he reasoned. Dr. Patel listened patiently as they described Lily's behavior. She nodded thoughtfully, her fingers tapping against her notepad. "Sleepwalking can be a manifestation of stress or anxiety in children." "Has anything changed in Lily's life recently?" Sarah and Mark shook their heads. Lily was a happy, well-adjusted child with a loving family and good friends. There were no recent traumas or major life changes. Dr. Patel suggested a sleep study and recommended some relaxation techniques to help Lily unwind before bed. "It's important to create a calm and consistent bedtime routine," she advised. Chapter 3. The Sleep Study. The sleep study took place the following week. Lily was excited, thinking it was some kind of sleepover at the hospital. Sarah and Mark, on the other hand, were filled with apprehension. Lily was hooked up to various monitors and sensors, and the technicians assured Sarah and Mark that they would be able to observe her throughout the night. As the hours passed, Sarah and Mark sat in the waiting room, trying to distract themselves with magazines and small talk. Around midnight, one of the technicians came to get them. "You need to see this," she said, her voice low and urgent. They followed her to the observation room where they watched Lily on the monitor. She was sleepwalking again, her eyes closed, her movements slow and deliberate. But this time something was different. Lily's hand moved to her chest, and she began to draw something in the air. The technicians enhanced the video feed, and Sarah and Mark watched in horror as their daughter traced an inverted pentagram. "I'm sorry. The devil told me to," Lily whispered again. The technician paused the video. "We've never seen anything like this," she admitted. "It's as if she's channeling something." Chapter 4. Seeking Answers. Sarah and Mark left the hospital more confused and frightened than ever. They decided to consult Father Thomas, the priest at their local church. He'd always been a comforting presence, and they hoped he might have some insight. Father Thomas listened intently as they recounted Lily's behavior and the results of the sleep study. He crossed himself and leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. "There are forces in this world that we do not fully understand," he began slowly. "Sometimes they can influence the vulnerable, especially children. I believe Lily might be under some sort of spiritual attack. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Father Thomas suggested a blessing of their home and a series of prayers to protect Lily. "We must strengthen her spirit and shield her from these dark influences," he explained. The blessing took place the next day. Father Thomas sprinkled holy water in every room, chanting prayers of protection. He placed a crucifix above Lily's bed and instructed Sarah and Mark to pray with her every night. Chapter 5. The stranger's arrival. For a few nights, the sleepwalking seemed to stop. Lily slept soundly, and Sarah and Mark began to hope that the worst was behind them. But their relief was short-lived. One evening, a stranger arrived at their doorstep. He was an elderly man dressed in a worn suit with a kind but tired expression on his face. He introduced himself as Mr. Hargrove, a retired professor of ancient religions and folklore. "I've heard about your daughter's situation from Father Thomas," he explained. "I believe I can help." Desperate for answers, Sarah and Mark invited him in. Mr. Hargrove listened carefully to their story, occasionally nodding and taking notes. "It sounds like Lily might be influenced by a malevolent spirit," he said finally. "I've studied many such cases, and I believe there are steps we can take to rid her of this entity." Mr. Hargrove suggested a more thorough investigation into the history of their home and the surrounding area. "Sometimes spirits are tied to specific locations," he explained. "If we can find out why this spirit is here, we might be able to banish it." Chapter 6. Unearthing the Past. Sarah and Mark dove into research, scouring old newspapers, town records, and local legends. They discovered that their property had once been part of a larger estate owned by a man named Jonathan Blackwood, a notorious occultist in the late 1800s. According to the records, Blackwood had conducted numerous dark rituals on the land, seeking to summon demonic entities. He had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and his estate had fallen into disrepair, eventually being divided and sold off. Mr. Hargrove was particularly interested in an old journal they found, belonging to Blackwood himself. The journal detailed his attempts to communicate with a powerful demon, whom he referred to as the Whisperer. "This demon seems to be the one influencing Lily," Mr. Hargrove said, frowning at the faded pages. "We need to perform a cleansing ritual to sever its connection to her." Chapter 7. The Cleansing Ritual. The ritual took place on a moonless night. Mr. Hargrove, Father Thomas, and the Thompsons gathered in the living room, surrounded by candles and protective symbols. Mr. Hargrove led the ritual, chanting in an ancient language as Father Thomas prayed and sprinkled holy water. Sarah and Mark held Lily's hands, whispering words of love and encouragement. As the ritual progressed, the temperature in the room dropped, and a sense of foreboding filled the air. Lily began to shiver, her eyes fluttering open and closed. "I'm sorry. The devil told me to," she whispered, her voice echoing strangely. Mr. Hargrove raised his voice, commanding the spirit to leave. "You have no power here. In the name of all that is holy, I banish you from this child." Lily let out a gasp, her body going rigid. For a moment it seemed as though the room itself was holding its breath. Then with a final burst of energy, the candles flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Chapter 8. A New Dawn. When the lights came back on, Lily was lying on the floor, breathing heavily but peacefully. Sarah and Mark rushed to her side, tears of relief streaming down their faces. Mr. Hargrove and Father Thomas looked exhausted, but triumphant. "It's done," Mr. Hargrove said quietly. "The connection is severed." Over the next few days, Lily's sleepwalking ceased entirely. She seemed happier and more energetic, free from the dark influence that had haunted her. Sarah and Mark were grateful to Mr. Hargrove and Father Thomas, knowing they had been given a second chance at peace. Chapter 9. The Final Twist. Months passed, and life returned to normal. One sunny afternoon, as Sarah was tidying up Lily's room, she found something strange under the bed, a small, blackened piece of paper, covered in Jonathan Blackwood's handwriting. Her heart pounded as she read the words. "The Whisperer shall return when the moon is new, and the bond shall be forged anew. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She hurried to find Mark, her mind racing with questions. How had the paper ended up in Lily's room? Was the danger truly gone, or had they only delayed the inevitable? As they pondered the mystery, a new moon rose outside, casting long shadows over their home. The battle might have been won, but the war against the darkness was far from over. The Thompsons knew they had to stay vigilant, for the whispers in the night had only just begun. Chapter 10. The Vigil. The discovery of the note left Sarah and Mark on edge, their unease growing with each passing day. They decided to keep a close watch on Lily, taking turns to stay up at night, hoping to catch any sign of the malevolent spirit's return. Lily, unaware of the note's contents, continued to live her life blissfully. Her laughter filled the house, a stark contrast to the anxiety gnawing at her parents. One night, as Mark sat in the living room, his eyes heavy with fatigue, he heard a faint sound. It was a whisper, barely audible, but it sent a shiver down his spine. He followed the sound to Lily's room, his heart pounding. Lily was asleep, her face peaceful, but there, standing at the foot of her bed, was a shadowy figure, its form barely visible in the dim light. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he watched the figure lean over and whisper into Lily's ear. Without thinking, Mark lunged forward, his hand reaching out to grab the figure, but as his fingers closed around it, the shadow dissipated, leaving only a cold, empty space. Lily stirred in her sleep, but did not wake. Mark stood there, trembling, as the realization sank in. The whisperer was back. Chapter 11. Gathering Allies. Mark and Sarah knew they couldn't face this threat alone. They reached out to Mr. Hargrove and Father Thomas, explaining the new development. Mr. Hargrove listened intently, his expression grave. "The demon's hold is stronger than we thought," he said. "We need to find a way to permanently banish it." Father Thomas suggested enlisting the help of other spiritual leaders in the community. "We need all the strength we can muster," he said. "This is a battle for Lily's soul." They gathered a diverse group of spiritual practitioners, a Buddhist monk, a Wiccan priestess, and a Native American shaman. Each brought their unique knowledge and rituals, hoping to combine their powers to defeat the demon once and for all. Chapter 12. The Ultimate Confrontation. The night of the new moon arrived, and the Thompsons' house was filled with the scent of incense and the sound of chanting. The spiritual leaders formed a circle around Lily, who lay peacefully in her bed, unaware of the storm about to unfold. Mr. Hargrove began the ritual, his voice strong and commanding. The others joined in, their chants blending into a powerful symphony of protection and banishment. The air grew thick with tension, and the temperature dropped once more. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, swirling around the circle, testing the barriers of their combined will. Lily began to stir, her face contorting in fear. "I'm sorry. The devil told me to," she whispered, her voice echoing with the demon's presence. Mr. Hargrove raised his voice, shouting the final words of the banishment ritual. "By the light of all that is holy, I command you to leave this child and return to the darkness from whence you came." The shadows recoiled, a deafening roar filling the room. Lily's body arched, her mouth opening in a silent scream. Then, with a final blinding flash of light, the shadows exploded outward, disappearing into nothingness. Chapter 13. The Aftermath. The room fell silent, the air still and heavy with the scent of burned incense. Lily lay on the bed, her breathing steady and calm. Sarah and Mark rushed to her side, their eyes filled with tears of relief. Mr. Hargrove and the others looked exhausted, but triumphant. "It's over," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The demon is gone." Over the next few days, the Thompsons worked to rebuild a sense of normalcy. They thanked each of the spiritual leaders, grateful for their help and sacrifice. Chapter 14. Moving Forward. Lily's sleepwalking ceased entirely, and she showed no signs of remembering the terrifying events. The house felt lighter, free from the oppressive darkness that had haunted them. Sarah and Mark, however, remained cautious. They kept the protective symbols in place and continued their nightly prayers, determined to shield their family from any future threats. One sunny afternoon, as Lily played in the garden, Sarah watched her daughter with a sense of renewed hope. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, their bond as a family unbreakable. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the garden, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what other secrets the night might hold. The battle against the darkness was never truly over, but they were ready to face whatever came next. For now they would cherish the light, and the whispers in the night would remain just that. Whispers, fading into the silence of a new dawn.